Aaron Friedman here, and this is Politodoxy. Today's topic, democracy. Oh, democracy, how wonderful and amazing you are. The best thing since sliced bread. People get to vote, voice their opinions. It's government by the people. But to paraphrase this guy I saw on the internet, the people have become stupid. Democracy in reality actually leads to mob rule, as we've seen in Canada. I've seen a lot of people say Justin Trudeau is a dictator, and I would try to correct them. Actually, he's doing what his state legislature wanted him to do. The state legislature gave him the power to do whatever he thought was necessary. So it can't be dictatorship. Dictatorship would mean that he usurped the will of the people. Well, he did not do so. What happened in Canada was actually mob rule, the majority cracking down its will on the minority. That is why our founding fathers did not like democracy. Every time they talked about democracy, they viewed it in unlikable terms. John Adams had to say about democracy, quote, "Remember, democracy never lasts long. It soon wastes, exhausts, and murders itself. There never was a democracy yet that did not commit suicide," unquote. James Madison said, quote, "Democracies have been found incompatible with personal security or the rights of property, and in general been as short in their lives as they have been violent in their death," unquote. Alexander Hamilton said, quote, "It has been observed that a pure democracy, if it were practicable, would be the most perfect government. Experience has proved that no position is more false than this. The ancient democracies in which the people themselves deliberated never possessed one good feature of government. Their very character was tyranny, their figure deformity," unquote. John Marshall said, quote, "Between a balanced republic and a democracy, the difference is like that between order and chaos," unquote. And of course, how can we forget Ambrose Bierce? Democracy is four wolves and a lamb voting on what to have for lunch. That is why we are a constitutional republic. Now this is where things get interesting, if it wasn't interesting yet. One of Greece's highest achievements, philosophy, was very suspicious of its other achievement, democracy. Greece's founding father of philosophy, Socrates, is portrayed in the dialogues of Plato extremely pessimistic of the business of democracy. Socrates compared society to a ship and asked the question, if you were headed out to sea, would you want anybody to run the ship, or would you want highly skilled sailors to get you to your destination? Adeimantus, the person who Socrates was talking to, answered, of course, the highly skilled sailors. Socrates then asked the question, then why do we assume that anybody could lead and be a ruler of a country? The point Socrates was trying to make was voting is a skill, not a random intuition, and like a skill, it needs to be taught systematically to people. Letting the citizenry vote without an education is a society begging itself to commit suicide. We all know how Socrates' life ended. He was put to death by a majority vote of the people on trumped-up charges on corrupting the youth. Now, Socrates wasn't an elitist. He didn't think that a random few of elite people should be the ones who ever vote, but he did think that only those who have thought about it and understand the rules and laws and have a stake in society, those should be the people who are allowed to vote. But we have forgotten that very important point. We have given the right to vote to all, but without wisdom, and that has given rise to demagoguery. Socrates asks us to imagine an election between two candidates, a sweet shop owner and a doctor. The sweet shop owner would start shouting that the doctor has worked many evils on you. He hurts you, he tells you not to drink or eat what you want, gives you bitter potions. He will never serve you feasts of many delicious and scrumptious foods such as I. Socrates then asks his students, do you think the doctor would be able to reply effectively? If the doctor would tell them the truth, the reason why I hurt you is to heal you and give you a better life, that'll cause an uproar. We have forgotten that voting is only as good as the people who vote. And sometimes, a benevolent dictator is better. Yes, you heard me right. Dictatorship is sometimes better than democracy. There are some cultures who do not respect or care for human rights. Such societies exist nowadays, a lot of it in the Middle East, a lot of it in Africa, but it's not only limited to those parts of the world. It's in China, it's in Russia. Such societies has existed in Italy and in Germany. Let's not forget France. As a matter of fact, before Napoleon came to power, France was under the spell of mob rule. Let's not forget that Edmund Burke said of the French, since they do not understand the rights of ordinary citizens and believe can be taken away, then it should be better for them to have a dictatorship. Also, Edmund Burke was one of the great defenders of America in its early days of separation from the crown. Under the mob rule of the French, religion was thrown out, replaced by a new secular religion. 600,000 people were killed or thrown out of the country. It was such a dire time, the French, who initiated it themselves, called it the Terror. I know liberals really love to say that the French Revolution was one of the great triumphs of democracy. Democracy does not have that much triumphs, let me tell you that. And yes, the French Revolution was a very good reflection of democracy. Only after the dictator Napoleon, and I'm using the word dictator just as a matter of fact of what he was, and absolutely not as a pejorative. Only after Napoleon came to power is when things got back to some semblance of normalcy. Religion was welcome back to France. Minorities were under the protection of the great Napoleon. The beheadings stopped, and France was put on a path to victory throughout Europe. Now, of course, this has to be said because apparently some people don't know it, even though it's this obvious, that I'm not asking for a dictatorship in the United States. Far from it. I'm just stating pure facts that not all societies are cut out to be democracies or republics, such as we see in Middle Eastern countries and Russia, China, and so on. And it has nothing to do with race, although it has a lot to do with culture. And it's very easy to think about nation building in these countries. We will just topple the dictator. Oh, let's see how it worked out in Iraq. Now let's see how it worked out in Libya. Not so well, did it? It's easy for us, a nation that has been bestowed an amazing constitution with rights, to start thinking everybody must be like us. It's so easy. That's just not true. Even for us as a country, we had to fight a civil war in order to make sure that everybody understood that when the Declaration of Independence says that people are born with certain unalienable rights, it means everyone. And still, after the Civil War, we had to have a civil rights movement, because apparently the Democrats still wouldn't get the hint, even after being beat in a civil war. And I also find it hilarious that now the Democrats take all the credit for the civil rights movement, when it was always the majority of the Republicans pushing through civil rights legislation. But that's a story for another day. But what we understand from history is human value was not always realized, and shouting on everybody you don't like is a dictator and everything you like is democracy is just plain silly. The word dictator, all it means is you dictate. Nowadays, we have thousands of little dictators spread throughout the country deciding on what new rule or what new regulation everybody is gonna have to follow just because they decided that it is necessary to do so. Let's take the word dictator for a moment and understand exactly why it's not supposed to be a bad word. As we have discussed, dictator means a person that dictates one way or the other. In other words, making choices, like literally every king in the history of the world was a dictator. And I'm specifically referring to those kings with absolute power, of course. The Roman Empire had multiple dictators throughout its time. The emperor would declare himself dictator when a crisis occurred. And the most amazing part of it is he would always step down after the crisis was dealt with. Now, isn't that amazing? A person that is all-powerful now stepping down because the crisis has been dealt with. As we can see, the word dictator, all it means is the person deciding to dictate, making choices on one way or the other. Much like a democracy, except a democracy is thousands and thousands of dictators deciding what to do with the minority. So, if you ask me, I'd rather have none. But if I have to choose between one dictator or thousands of dictators, I think I'll choose the one. But thank God I don't need to do that. I could just live in the United States, where things are not perfect and things are deteriorating at an alarming rate. We still have a voice and power to change it. Now let's look where democracies have been implemented and since then where things have gone awry. As we said, the Middle East, except for Israel, largely do not respect human rights. And ever since the fall of the Ottoman Empire, things there have gotten much more and more democratized. But is the Middle East better off than it was under the Ottoman Empire? Of course it isn't. Let's take Iran, for example. America installed the Shah in Iran. While I know liberals hate the Shah with the biggest passion you could imagine, the Shah of Iran was actually a very liberal guy compared to the other people in his country. He gave women the right to vote. And apparently, for some, he was being too liberal. So they overthrew him because to them, they did not understand nor respect this idea that a woman has a right to vote, plus all the other liberal things he initiated. Now, I've also heard about how repressive his regime was. Let's not talk about the liberal things he has done. Let's only talk about the repressive things he has done, such as he had a secret police force that would go around and kill all the dissenters. That's pure evil. Yeah, of course it is evil, but let's not act as if, since then, anything has gotten better in Iran. That same police force still exists, only under a different name. Now let's take a look at the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was a place of knowledge, medicine, literature, philosophy, and so much more. And that was under the dictatorships of the sultans. And of course, we're talking about at the height of the Ottoman Empire, not the later stages, when it became more liberal and Europe was openly applauding it as it became more liberal. It became more democratized. Power was now shared between the Sultan and his advisors. And then, only then, in middle of World War I, they started the Armenian genocide. That happened under a more democratized Ottoman Empire because some people do not understand human rights. And one person has to rise above them all to put them back into place and protect the rights of the minority. This is the benevolent dictator. I fully understand that not all dictators are benevolent, but that is the same with democracy. Sometimes you have to take the lesser of two evils. And this is why I just cringe every time I hear when American politicians say that Putin has to be dealt with, he needs to be taken out immediately, taken out all the time. I hear this language and I think to myself, these people do not understand human nature, and they think that taking out Putin would solve all the problems. As a matter of fact, we have no idea who is waiting in the rings. I say, better the devil I do know than the devil I don't know. I say, let people decide who they want their leaders to be. And I'm not opposed to the United States exerting power over the world, showing dominance, as long as it is not militarily done on unjustifiable reasons. We should not help Ukraine militarily. We should try to approach this matter diplomatically. Ukraine is not America. It's not our problem. We have gotten involved in something that is not our business. And I'm talking about when America got involved in Ukraine's elections and made sure that they would choose the pro-American candidate instead of the pro-Russia candidate, even though a majority of Ukrainians wanted the pro-Russia candidate. And fast forward, now we are here. America got involved and usurped the will of the Ukrainian people, and now people are dying. Yes, Putin is killing people, but America is supposed to be the adult in the room, and I don't see much adulting from America. The question always is, why do I have to care if Ukraine is under the dictatorship of Vladimir Zelensky or the dictatorship of Vladimir Putin? Why should I care which Vladimir controls Ukraine? Should we undermine our enemies? Yes, but not at the cost of nuclear war. Now, back to the main subject, another way of thinking of democracy is passengers on an airplane before liftoff, and two people walk in. One, the pilot. The second, just an ordinary rich guy. The pilot says, if you elect me as your pilot, I will get you to your destination safe and sound. The rich guy says, if you elect me as your pilot, I will give for everybody on this airplane a first-class ticket. And because the population has not been educated and the population has been dumbed down, of course they vote for the rich guy and they all die. coincidentally, which party promises you free stuff and which party promises you have the right to pursue your happiness. Now to explain why America is not a democracy. For one, we have the 50 states. Each state decides its own governors and legislatures. Then we have something called the Congress. I'm sure you heard of it. It has two branches. One branch is called the House. The second branch is called the Senate. The House represents the popular vote, and the Senate represents the individual states. As a matter of fact, it used to be that the senators were not elected by the popular vote of each state, only by the legislature of each state. Then finally, we have the Electoral College, where every state gets an amount of electoral votes, and the majority of each state gives its votes to a specific candidate, and the candidate with the most electoral votes becomes president. Now, with all that said, there's also one more thing that protects us from mob rule. It's the Constitution and the amendment process. The Constitution is above all other law in the United States, and to add or repeal amendments require an extraordinary amount of power. Supermajorities in both House and Senate, in other words, 2/3. Then it is sent to the state's governors, and the governors submit it to the state's legislatures. After a majority within each state votes to ratify it, you have to have 3/4 of the states that ratify the new amendment or repeal the old amendment, and after you have 3/4, that's when it becomes enshrined in the Constitution. Now, there's always loopholes, there are always workarounds, and that mob is always ready for a fight. That is why we need an educated populace to vote and make sure that every legal vote is counted. Now to lay out a plan on what to do for the future. In no particular order, the 26th Amendment has to be repealed, and the new voting age should be set at 24 years old, because as we know, the brain stops developing at 24 years old, or around that age. The whole reason why we said 18-year-olds can vote is because we had a lower drinking age back then. But nowadays, the drinking age is at 21. So at the very least, let's bring that voting age up to 21. The question is, why would you not be allowed to drink, something that affects you and only you as long as you are responsible, but be allowed to vote, something that affects all of us? The society has a national interest in deciding who gears it to which way. So I'm even ready to make a compromise at 21 years old. Next, there should be a questionnaire on the very basic rules that govern this great society. Nothing too extraordinary, just enough that a person who does not understand the basic form of government we have should be disqualified from voting. Next, no criminals should be allowed to vote. Also, I will put an exception on you have to be 21 years old in order to vote if you join the military, in which case, even if you are 18, you should be allowed to vote. Since you are making an investment in this society, you should get a voice early on how it is steered. Also, it should be a national holiday. One day is voting day. No more early voting, no mail-in voting, absentee voting. Okay, you could have electrical voting machines, but it has to be backed up by paper ballots. And let's not forget high security around those machines. And they rule that any ballots discovered after Election Day is disqualified, regardless of how many. Unless proven it has been hidden on purpose to discount the vote, no such ballots should be counted. And if it is the case that ballots has been forgotten, there should be very harsh penalties on those people responsible. Oh, and this other rule. I can't believe I actually have to make this point. If you are the Secretary of State and you're the one overseeing your own election, you have to recuse yourself from your position. I'm looking at you, Katie Hobbs. And another thing, this shouldn't be a legal matter, but it should be a disqualifying matter within the eyes of the public, that if you refuse to debate, you should be disqualified from the election. Not legally, but in the eyes of the public. Now, there's so much more we can talk about on how we can fix, educate, and make sure we vote with prudence and virtue. But sadly, here is where we have to end. I thank you very much for listening, and let me know what you think. You could reach out to me on Truth Social at Aaron Friedman. You could also leave a comment on this episode on Spotify. Please share this episode with as many people as you can. People need to be educated on this subject. And finally, please leave 5 stars and I bid you farewell. Let's go, Brandon.